No king rules forever. These words, spoken by Tyrannus Menethil II to Arthas at the moment of his death, have become something of a cudgel for the World of Warcraft player base to wield against Blizzard for its many missteps since the game's golden age, which is now a distant memory. This is understandable. For one, game enthusiasts have a penchant for dancing on the graves of once great studios that have mistreated their intellectual properties, whether or not it's deserved. But let us not forget that Activision Blizzard was the focal point of arguably the most salacious scandal in the history of the gaming industry during Shadowlands' first major patch cycle, Chains of Domination. The ire that World of Warcraft players felt didn't exist in a vacuum. It was earned by Blizzard's own actions and inactions. It was cathartic to throw those words right back at Blizzard at the height of its worst public relations nightmare. No king rules forever indeed. It truly felt as though the sun was setting on World of Warcraft, but nothing could have been further from the truth. For the last month, I have completely immersed myself in World of Warcraft's newest expansion, The War Within, which ushers forth the Worldsoul Saga in a new era in the game's 20-year history. In an effort to bring you the most extensive review of The War Within on YouTube, I've invested every moment that I could afford into this new chapter in the ongoing saga of World of Warcraft. Based on the video's length, I'm sure you've guessed that I have a lot to say. First, a spoiler warning. Typically, World of Warcraft's story isn't worth preserving, but The War Within's narrative contains moments that I would encourage you to experience on your own. If you haven't completed the campaign, then close this video and come back to it once you have. Second, a plea for patience. We're only a couple of months beyond the release of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, and since that's the game that I play most often, my experience with that expansion is still fresh in my mind. As a result, more than a few comparisons between the titles will be made. And third, let's be sure to thank today's sponsor. It's Zenless Zone Zero. I'm just kidding, it's me again. Get all videos 2 days early and ad-free for only $1 a month on Patreon. In the MMORPG genre, narrative has historically been low on the list of priorities for players. Typically, we're concerned with gameplay, function, collection, progression. No one logs into Black Desert Online or Lost Ark desperate to know what happens in the next cutscene. They log in to press buttons and to make their numbers go up. There are some MMOs that are primarily driven by their narratives. The Old Republic, The Lord of the Rings Online, and Final Fantasy XIV are the few that come to mind. But World of Warcraft has, in my estimation, fallen into the former category of MMOs that are played largely in spite of their stories and not because of them. Yet Blizzard has poured an inordinate amount of resources into presenting plots that, at best, no one cared about, and at worst, were completely laughable. During BlizzCon 2023, Chris Metzen said that when it comes to Warcraft's storytelling, they aren't messing around. Big talk for a man representing the studio that just delivered Alex Strauss's 2-year-long inoffensive therapy session. How could The War Within and the broader Worldsoul Saga build a satisfying narrative on the foundations laid down by Shadowlands and Dragonflight? I didn't believe that it could be done. I'm afraid to report that, after playing The War Within extensively over the last few weeks, I'm a believer.
I can feel the Void's influence upon her. She's Xalatath's creature now.
How could you know that?
I'll begin by giving you my thoughts on The War Within's campaign from a bird's eye perspective before delving, no pun intended, into the specific story beats that worked and the one that didn't. As we approached the launch of the expansion, Blizzard released a few preparatory quests and cutscenes to set the stage for the Worldsoul Saga. The tonal shift in both the writing of the quests and the directing of the accompanying cinematics was such a stark improvement that it was almost jarring. It was as if an entirely new team was stewarding World of Warcraft, perhaps a team unleashed or one with the right direction.
Who they are and what they intend to do remains a mystery, which is why I need your help.
To hunt down a dangerous foe we know nothing about. Honestly, I could use the distraction.
Same old Delaria, void or no void. I didn't mean to,
See you soon, Khadgar.
Once The War Within began, I immediately noticed a strong sense of intention from Blizzard's narrative presentation. From the use of dialogue to deliver characterization rather than purely exposition, to the deliberate positioning of the cast between scenes to convey their emotions, it was clear that the developers were going to greater lengths than they previously had in order to craft a more willful experience. With a compelling introduction for Xalatath, the best villain to grace Warcraft since the Lich King, and a strong inciting incident to propel the plot forwards, The War Within hits the ground running while never feeling rushed. I found the pacing case of the expansion's primary plot to be brisk, yet steady, and intelligently designed to introduce the player to the world, its inhabitants, and the unraveling plot of the Worldsoul Saga. My highest point of praise for The War Within is reserved for its playability. Obviously, over the last 2 decades, World of Warcraft has resembled itself less and less, trading in the grueling leveling journey that you would have found in Classic in favor of snappier gameplay and a session-based seasonal grind. The mentality across the player base has always been that World of Warcraft had diluted its core identity, but I think that The War Within makes the argument for the establishment of a new identity that's both unique from its origins and better for it. Between the player power that unlocks as you add points to your hero talents and the availability of skywriting at the onset of the expansion, Blizzard has created an environment where gameplay is the highest priority. The formula is simple yet brilliantly executed. First, provide the player with a compelling narrative context to bolster the intrinsic value of his or her activity in the game. Second, provide the player with a satisfying gameplay loop, which World of Warcraft has always excelled at, that expands as he or she levels. Third, convert the movement between objectives into gameplay rather than a tedious function, so that the player is in a constant state of flow. I can't help but think of Dawntrail in this regard. 22 hours of cutscenes interrupted by brief bursts of gameplay totaling 2.5, maybe 3 hours. Completely static movement between objectives, neither a rare enemy nor a point of intrigue to stumble upon in the world. Having just played through that expansion a couple of months ago, the difference between these two experiences is stark. In terms of playability throughout its campaign and beyond, World of Warcraft firmly blows Final Fantasy XIV and most other MMOs on the market out of the water. I would also argue that this is going to get me into a lot of trouble. The War Within story is also stronger than Dawntrail's, which is a sentence that I cannot believe I've just written, recorded, and published. If you would have told me 3 years ago, at the height of Shadowlands' worst patch cycle, that World of Warcraft's story would outdo Final Fantasy XIV's, I would have called you a Yet, here we are. It's my opinion that Blizzard has delivered a narrative experience to match its greatest rival in Final Fantasy XIV, and it's done this not by mimicking 14's grandiose 300-hour narrative structure, but by telling a lean, urgent, and satisfying story that invites the player to participate in the journey rather than ripping control away from the player to present it.
Few names hold higher esteem. You must be a lady, or...
Oh no, don't you start using formalities on me. Wait, if your grandfather was king of this Stormwind, then Anduin, my new friend, are you a king?
Not anymore. So, don't you start using formalities on me, either.
A great deal of The War Within's depth is reserved for players like me who are willing to speak with NPCs unprompted just to see what they might have to say, or read an interactable book hidden inside a tavern, or never miss an opportunity to stay a while and listen. While the primary plot of the game is lean, the world building at work in the expansion is substantial, and it's tastefully deployed as an optional feature for those of us who might be into that sort of thing. Where The War Within's narrative truly shines is in its optional side quests, which are some of the most heart-wrenching and beautiful stories that World of Warcraft has ever served its players. While some develop on the intrigue of Cas Algar, which is worth a great deal to the world building of the expansion, others are brief glimpses into the lives of the inhabitants of these distant lands as they grapple with meaning, belonging, and death. As I write this, I'm reminded of the tale of the Morning Rise, the final resting place of many unbound Earthen who chose to die free of the Titan cycle of rebirth. Its caretaker, Korgrin, is approaching the hour of his final shutdown. As his memory wanes, we tend to his needs at the twilight of his life that he could be remembered as the unbound he chose to be. Bravo, Blizzard. You've done a fantastic job creating a world for the players who are willing to spend the time reading these brilliantly written stories. This is far and away a standard of quality that World of Warcraft has not previously reached, and I urge you, all of you, to take your time with these small snippets of narrative. Buy in for a moment. Suspend your function-focused mind, stop chasing after a higher item level for just a minute, and allow yourself to soak in these gorgeous vignettes. You'll thank me later.
The light will return. Even if someone else carries the torch.
The campaign of The War Within is doing its fair share of heavy lifting too. While you shouldn't expect a tearjerker like Shadowbringers, it's better for Blizzard to aim for consistency rather than to stretch itself thin to reach the heights of its greatest competitor in the genre. This story, more than any of World of Warcraft's previous expansions, succeeds at humanizing a cast that by all accounts should have been shelved ages ago. I was particularly pleased with the turn that Magni Bronzebeard's character took. Being transformed into the Speaker of Azeroth only to be left high and dry by Azeroth herself would be a massive bummer for any of us, which makes his turmoil completely believable. Seeing him freed of his crystalline prison and granted flesh made me feel something, which was a surprise. Alongside a solid secondary cast in his daughter, Moira, and especially his grandson, Dagran, who I am very fond of, Magni's arc was a satisfying story of a man reclaiming his life and slowly mending the frayed bonds of a complicated family. Anduin's story, which is coupled well with the Arathi of Hallowfall, also exceeded my expectations. I found his crisis of faith highly relatable and his anxieties understandable, but it cannot be overstated how much his characterization is bolstered by Farron Lothar, likely my favorite secondary character to be introduced in The War Within. Her warmth and endless optimism are a powerful contrast to Anduin's self-loathing and despair. Her suffering is visible, from her missing left arm to the scars on her face to her missing eye, yet her faith is unwavering, which inspires Anduin, who ultimately regains his light as he learns to forgive himself for the ordeal in the Shadowlands. To be honest, I expected to be sick of Anduin in The War Within, but he demonstrated vulnerability, maturity, and resolve, which is less than what could be said about one void adult elf we all know and love. Of the primary characters in The War Within, Illyria Windrunner is the game's focal point. The cutscene camera loves her unblended eyeshadow, and her face is plastered all over the expansion's promotional material, second only to Xal'atath. Listen, I quite like Illyria. I enjoy that she carries thousands of years of emotional baggage with her, even if she doesn't always act like it. I like her fierce loyalty to her companions, and I like that she's one of the few characters in World of Warcraft who is unabashedly in love. What can I say? I like the romantic stuff. She is, however, undeniably the weakest member of the game's main cast. Illyria plays a crucial role in the War Within's narrative, serving as the primary means through which the player gets to see and hear Xal'atath due to Illyria's connection to the Void. Their interplay is a lot of fun to watch, Illyria always brooding and desperate for vengeance, and Xal'atath amused by Illyria's rage and always 7 steps ahead. Illyria watched Xal'atath destroy Dalaran. She believed that Khadgar was dead. Her anger was certainly justified, but for an ancient being like her to lack the wisdom or the foresight to avoid making completely senseless decisions, which put both herself and her comrades in danger repeatedly, was frustrating because we've seen this before. Illyria's arc in The War Within bears echoes of Tyrande Whisperwind and the Night Warrior storyline, which I'd prefer to never think about again. Thankfully, it seems as though the writers have chosen to resolve Illyria's blind rage quickly rather than over the course of several expansions, but it is still worth stating that a character who is as critical as she is to the Worldsoul Saga should have been handled a little better in this expansion. All in all, The War Within has been a completely unexpected surprise from a studio that has, for the better part of the last 2 decades, struggled to tell a compelling story. While the first expansion of the Worldsoul Saga is not groundbreaking, I can't understate how much the storytelling has improved the experience. It seems unthinkable, but I no longer classify World of Warcraft as the type of MMO that I play in spite of its story. Turns out, I kinda wanna know what happens next. Now that we've thoroughly discussed the War Within story, let's talk a bit about its presentation. As some of you know, I have a background in music, so I'm always listening intently to a game's soundtrack. I've long appreciated World of Warcraft for using its score to color its environments rather than to dominate the player's attention. The theme for Elwyn Forest is a notable example of Warcraft's music at its best. It's subtle, yet instantly recognizable and intensely nostalgic. However, Warcraft's music has never been strong enough to stand alone, in my opinion. I'm sure that you're expecting me to say that the War Within soundtrack remedies that, but the truth is that it doesn't, although I never expected it to. The soundtrack for the territories of Khazalgar serves the same purpose as it would in any other part of Azeroth, which is to provide ambience and to stay out of the way, but what's remarkable about this expansion soundtrack is how effective it is at fulfilling its purpose. As I played through the game's campaign, I was shocked at the sheer quantity of music in each individual area. Cities, villages, interiors, exteriors, landmarks, the wilderness. Every time I moved from one space to another, there was another medley waiting for me, and some of these pieces are gorgeous. While I have your attention on the world itself, I cannot praise the War Within zones enough. Well, except for you, Ringing Deeps, you're not that great. Blizzard's environment designers have always delivered, so I wasn't surprised to find a beautifully rendered world to explore, but the scale of Khazalgar was unexpected. This place is huge. While the Dragon Isles were sprawling and wide, Khazalgar goes even further beyond while adding depth to the dimension of the world. It's difficult to fathom how Blizzard's engineers pulled off this particular party trick, but seeing Hallowfall and Ashkahet for the first time was extremely impressive. Now, that isn't to say that the Isle of Dorn and the Ringing Deeps aren't good locations in their own right, but they lack that sheer size that the latter zones boast. The Isle of Dorn especially is all the better for it. It doesn't have to be humongous. That it's our only outdoor area in the expansion makes it refreshing anytime that I need to return to Dornogal. Speaking of which, Dornogal is one of the better city hubs that I've seen in Warcraft since, well, Stormwind? This city feels less like it was built to accommodate a function and more like it was handcrafted to look and feel like a city. Now, it isn't the most organized layout the game has ever seen, but one could argue that Oribos takes the crown for organization while also being mind-numbingly boring. I really like Dornogal. I like hanging out and crafting there, and I think Blizzard's environment team hit it out of the park on this one. There is a judicious use of space in this expansion's zones, which draws the player's attention towards specific points in the sky and on the ground. Khazalgar is dotted with these orbs of resonance crystals that you can collect by flying through them, which is simple yet excellent game design. This is coupled with a concerted effort to draw the player back to the ground. The zones are littered with items to dig up, treasure chests to unlock, rares to fight, nothing too different from the Dragon Isles of course, but it feels like the density of stuff to interact with in the world is even greater in the War Within. Speaking of density, Blizzard went above and beyond to fill Khazalgar's population centers with tons of NPCs, which makes the world feel alive. Maraldar is particularly impressive in this regard, featuring incredible levels of detail both on the city exteriors and in the interiors. This is all stuff that most players will miss on their way to their next big objective, but I took the time to appreciate the artistry on display here. To the team that was in charge of making these structures feel lived in, each of you did a fantastic job. I'm also pleased with Blizzard's commitment to improving the visual clarity of the user interface in World of Warcraft. We got a sleeker spellbook, updated quest icons, and a commitment to account-wide parity via warbands, which we'll discuss later, all of which makes for a more sensible and approachable experience. As commendable as Blizzard's efforts are to modernize this game after 20 years of service, World of Warcraft does feel like a game that is tearing apart at the seams. Excluding pre-rendered cutscenes, it's clear that the in-engine toolset has simply reached the limit of what it can offer.
Flames! They were ready for us.
Leading to a jarring disparity in quality between story beats. The game's network infrastructure is still unable to bear the load of a massively multiplayer online game, leading to input lag that makes the game frankly unplayable. The theater event on the Isle of Dorn consistently reveals this weakness. Additionally, I was shocked at the amount of writing errors that I encountered in both the primary campaign and the various side quests. Visual glitches, world bosses despawning, quests breaking, the list goes on. The most egregious issue I encountered was during a Tier 7 Bountiful Delve when Pagsley, the NPC that you're meant to escort through the waterworks, stood atop a pillar and wouldn't climb down from it. He was completely stuck, which meant that I was too. I searched for a solution on the forums and was recommended logging out and back in again, which demoted the Bountiful Delve while doing nothing to solve the issue. I was literally unable to complete the delve and had to teleport out. This isn't a minor gripe. A piece of endgame content broke and was incompletable as a result. It is clear that the War Within was pulled out of the oven too early, which hurts the presentation of the Worldsoul Saga's first entry. For an MMO as storied as World of Warcraft to successfully reinvent itself, these details need to be sorted out before launch. What Blizzard has provided in the War Within as far as presentation goes is mostly exceptional, diminished only by the weight of 20 years of technical debt and an obviously truncated development cycle. It's a bit difficult to believe that I'm 6.5 pages into the script about a video game and I haven't yet addressed what it's like to play it, so let's fix that. Between my latest upload and this review of The War Within, I've taken an unreasonably long time, which is something that I regret. I wish I could have turned this video around more quickly, but I promise you that this was deliberate. Whether you or I like it or not, World of Warcraft is a seasonal game, which means that I would be doing you all a disservice if I discussed The War Within's gameplay without discussing its seasonal endgame loop. So let's start at the beginning and work our way towards the end. The leveling experience in The War Within doesn't revolutionize MMO quest design. Ultimately, you will be sent to a location to click on an item or to slaughter a crowd of enemies in exchange for gear and experience points, but it is good. Not to repeat myself, but the narrative context reinforces the journey, while the hero talents provide an enticing carrot on a stick to continue chasing after. Itemization is still satisfying, as the steady increase of your damage output will never stop feeling good. And the world is vividly rendered with plenty of collectibles and secret efforts to inspire the player to detour from the linear narrative. With all that said, this has been a solid, brisk, and enjoyable leveling experience with some standout moments carried by World of Warcraft's industry-leading combat. Now, let's focus on hero talents for a moment. This is one of the War Within's back-of-the-box features, which has been the source of a great deal of contention in the community ever since its announcement. Now that we can finally play with these talents ourselves, it seems that they're neither as transformative nor as inconsequential as content creators insisted that they'd be for the last year. From what I can tell, hero talents are a future-proofing solution to the inevitable issue of talent bloat across the length of the Worldsoul Saga. Had Blizzard simply extended the talent trees that were introduced in Dragonflight, then World of Warcraft would have encountered the same issue that led to the removal of talent trees altogether in Mists of Pandaria. Outside of a few choice nodes, build variety in hero talents is virtually non-existent. In addition, your chosen path does little to affect your class identity, which is one of the more disappointing aspects of this feature. During the lead up to Shadowlands, Ian Hazzikostas talked about wanting the player's Covenant selection to drastically impact their class identity, so that you wouldn't see an enhancement shaman running around, but a Venthyr enhancement shaman. I could be misremembering this, but I vaguely recall seeing a player's chosen Covenant in the game's tooltip. Someone in the comments correct me on that, please. Either way, I think that something as simple as adding the player's hero talent path into the tooltip could go a long way to improve their sense of a new identity. As of now, I don't think of myself as a totemic enhancement shaman, even though that's what I'm playing. Thankfully, hero talents are fantastic when it counts. So far, I've only leveled an enhancement shaman and a shadow priest to 80 with a vengeance demon hunter on the way, but each hero talent selection has made my characters feel amazing. Totemic especially. I am a walking lightning storm, and I can't see myself getting sick of the specialization anytime soon. My positive experience with hero talents has inspired me to level more alts at a higher frequency than ever before just to see what the new talents feel like. Usually, I focus on one character at a time, so the fact that I'll have 3 at 80 by the time this video goes live is highly unusual for me, but a good sign that this new feature to World of Warcraft is a success. Great class design means absolutely nothing if there isn't a wide selection of content to express your itemization efforts and your mastery in. The War Within does not have that problem. Allow me to once again bring up Final Fantasy XIV for a brief comparison. As my Static and I are working our way through the raids here, we've built a loot log to keep track of everyone's best in slot gear. It's a fun personal goal to acquire the best gear for your job, but there is a futility in it too. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but outside of clearing Savage more quickly, there aren't any avenues of gameplay where having the best gear in the game really matters. Unfortunately, Dawntrail has done nothing to alleviate that issue. On the contrary, World of Warcraft has introduced more opportunities than ever for a player to feel their progression via moment-to-moment gameplay. Dragonflight was a leap forward from Shadowlands in terms of open world content, and the War Within carries that tradition forward, offering players plenty of world quests, bosses, and event spawns to chase after. I have been religiously hunting Belladar's spawn for that mount. No luck so far. Rather than surfing through a menu to access gameplay, World of Warcraft invites players to log in, mount up, and move through the world towards a combat objective, which I think feels fantastic. Another feature worth mentioning is the Awakening Machine in the Ringing Deeps, a wave-based combat challenge that requires the player to employ some strategy to get through it. At lower item levels, this can be fairly challenging since it's more important to figure out how to neutralize the enemies rather than simply pumping as much damage out as possible. Radiant Echoes are another world event that players can participate in. Similar to the pre-patch event for the War Within, you have to slay as many memories as possible to earn rewards within the time limit. It's a simple yet functional feature that gives players another reason to go out into the open world and to kill things together. Of course, the biggest pillar of content added in the War Within are delves, another back-of-the-box feature alongside hero talents and warbands, which again, we will talk about later. Upon their announcement, I was skeptical. Blizzard has previously advertised solo-friendly content in the form of Torghast, which I didn't care for, so I thought it was bold when they announced that delves would be replacing raided battlegrounds in the weekly vault. At the time, it felt like a brash show of confidence, but having played through most of the delves available in the War Within so far, I am blown away. I didn't realize how much I wanted content like this in World of Warcraft, but now I can't imagine the game without it. Delves are Blizzard's way of inviting the casual, isolated player into the seasonal treadmill of World of Warcraft's endgame. If anyone out there watched my previous video about World of Warcraft, then you'll know that I was a heroic raid leader during Dragonflight's final tier, so I'm not exactly averse to playing with others. That said, during this season of my life, I just can't commit to a consistent raid schedule. Thankfully, I don't have to. The most important thing that should be said about delves up front is that they are fun. I really appreciate the artistry on display in each delve, not only in their visual design, but in their various narratives. I'm especially fond of the one where you eat shrooms and hallucinate your way through it. The fact that Blizzard even bothered to rotate the stories of each delve day by day is a commitment to quality that I hope we continue to see going forward. As I was making my way through a delve after reaching level 80, I remember being struck by a particular thought. This is the most video game that World of Warcraft has ever been. Rather than working up a sweat to top the damage meters, I was fully engaged in what was happening in front of me. I was bouncing on mushroom caps, fighting secret treasures, and even struggling a bit as I climbed the tiers in pursuit of greater rewards. I'm not a particularly skilled player by any stretch of the imagination, but I found that delves had the capacity to pose a firm but fair combat challenge, especially if you aren't already geared enough to mitigate the danger. At around tier 6 or 7, I had to start thinking carefully about spending my interrupts on the right enemy cast and utilizing my crowd control judiciously. I have a pretty terrible habit of saving my cooldowns for a rainy day, but I quickly realized that I wouldn't make it to the end of a tier 8 delve if I was playing too conservatively. Delves are a humongous win for Blizzard, and especially for the players. Being allowed to pursue meaningful gear upgrades on my own terms and in my own time, while having a blast all the while, has made me feel more engaged with this seasonal rollout than I have in years. To launch a new expansion with a feature as transformative to the endgame as this one was a risk, but it has more than paid off. Now, it's important not to overlook the War Within's dungeons. The main reason why these aren't as exciting as delves is because they aren't a new feature, but these 8 new dungeons are mostly brilliant with one glaring exception. As we've all come to expect from a World of Warcraft expansion, we are treated to 4 level up dungeons through the campaign, then 4 more dungeons at max level. For the War Within, I elected to use the newly added follower dungeon feature. Listen, I cannot recommend this enough. World of Warcraft players are not known for their kindness or their patience or their ability to gauge a reasonable number of enemies to pull at once. Alongside the benefit of being able to avoid a long queue time as an enhancement shaman, I was also able to work my way through each dungeon at a steady yet reasonable pace, giving me more time to take in the sights of these finely crafted encounters. The max level dungeons are a bit of a mixed bag. I really loved the Cinderbrew Meadery. It feels like the most in tune with its theme, and the encounters are a lot of fun, but I have to say that the Dawnbreaker is a mess. While I appreciate how ambitious Blizzard's dungeon design has become ever since the addition of skywriting to the game, this dungeon feels like they tried to build a house of cards on a moving train, and it just doesn't work. Still, I appreciate the idea, I respect the attempt, but this is yet another example of the War Within being just slightly undercooked even a month after launch. At this point, I would have really loved to talk about the War Within's suite of mythic dungeons and its raid, but the truth is that I haven't had much interest in engaging with those pieces of content, owing mostly to how much more enjoyable I found delves to be. Let that be yet another ringing endorsement for Blizzard's newest pillar of endgame. Speaking of ringing endorsements, I'd like to briefly touch on warbands, which might be the most critical improvement to the infrastructure of World of Warcraft in the game's 20-year history. Skywriting is a lot of fun, yes, and delves are fantastic, but the warband system is the silent hero of the War Within, quietly carrying this ancient MMO on its back. A brief detour here, I am one of the 37 people who are still playing Lost Ark. I'm mentioning Lost Ark because it offers some structural features that make it far more intuitive than most other MMOs out there. I'm specifically referencing the roster system, which I think is totally brilliant. Without getting too far into the weeds, you don't play your character in Lost Ark, you play your account, with each character contributing to your account's growth via your roster level. This is represented by your roster being the first thing that the player sees when he or she logs into the game. Conversely, World of Warcraft has always been mired by its infrastructure as a game in which you play a character. Obviously, people have armies of alts, but for 20 years they were segmented from each other. Reputations, quest completion, special currencies, even appearance collection was all separated by character. But with the introduction of warbands, we're beginning to see the initial vestiges of a fully account-wide World of Warcraft. This system's implementation has alleviated one of the weird psychological issues that I've struggled to overcome whenever I've tried to invest more into World of Warcraft. That is the pressure of opportunity cost when you're choosing to play a character. Picking a main meant choosing against all of the others on the list. Not to mention that the list on the character screen alone was enough to inspire some eldritch anxiety by overwhelming me with choice. Knowing that the opportunity cost of investing into a character no longer exists since my warband unifies my progression across the War Within, and seeing my favorite characters in my roster, if you will, gathered around a campfire rather than sequestered in their character creation screen has solved this issue completely. Additionally, the warband system has made collection easier and therefore more enticing to dive into. Collecting appearances for armor types and classes that I'm not actively playing feels so much better than missing out on a cool transmog because I was logged in as my priest instead of my shaman. Easily transferring crucial materials across my warband is also a major improvement over the clunky system of buying and mailing shards of whatever the f to another character. As an example, upon hitting 80 with my shaman, I visited each renowned quartermaster to buy some early gear and improve my item level. The level of each of those renowned tracks and the currencies necessary to buy the equipment was mostly earned on my priest, but with account-wide progression and easily transferable currencies, it was barely an issue to kit my shaman with some powerful new gear. This feels amazing. I have been praying for World of Warcraft to implement a system like warbands for years, and I can't believe that it's finally here. This solves some of the most basic, structural, and fundamental problems that have plagued the game throughout its life. Now all we need is for this same account-wide progression to be retroactively applied to all of the expansions predating Dragonflight. Then I would have more than enough motivation to revisit dated zones and forgotten content, if only for the sake of further increasing the completion level of my account. With all of that said, playing The War Within has been a delight. Blizzard hasn't simply provided a good product, they've taken a risk by redefining what endgame can look like in World of Warcraft, something that they haven't done in years, all the while modernizing the core components of the game that have held it back from feeling as intuitive as its contemporary competitors. This is World of Warcraft at its best. There's a ton of content to engage with and more than enough unique classes and specializations to vary your experiences. Alongside mostly fantastic dungeons, a brisk leveling experience, and a beautiful, expansive open world, The War Within puts fun first, and I think that's worth celebrating. Now, let's talk about the future. I have one final comparison to make to Final Fantasy XIV, and it has to do with what comes next. Having a roadmap for a live service title is incredibly useful for a consumer to make an informed decision about whether or not to continue spending time, and money in this case, on the product. At the time of the publication of this video, Dawn Trail will be 9 or 10 weeks past its launch. I am actively rating Savage. I enjoy it, of course, otherwise I wouldn't do it, but I can't help but wonder, is this all I have to do for the next 6 months? When is Cosmic Exploration coming? What about the new field operation? Why didn't Dawn Trail launch with these features? I could go on, but this video isn't about Final Fantasy XIV. The next one will be, so sit tight for that scathing essay, but let me bring it back to World of Warcraft. Less than a month after launch, Blizzard has already informed the player base about what to expect from 11.0.5, which is the 20th anniversary event. I won't sit here and recite everything that's coming, but come on. Remastered Tier 2 armor? Classic time walking? A Blackrock Depths raid? This isn't even a major content patch, but there's already so much to look forward to. Even before we reach the anniversary, the expansion itself, as it currently stands, is defined by its willingness to take risks, to introduce new pillars of content, and to innovate at every turn. If this was a Final Fantasy XIV expansion, Delves would be introduced 16 months after launch, and they would offer absolutely no meaningful rewards. Does anybody remember Criterion Dungeons? As I put the finishing touches on the script, I'm currently enjoying the Legion time walking event during this week. A lot of you might say to yourselves, why isn't Legion time walking always available? I hate FOMO. The truth is that having these limited time events in the game creates a sense of urgency, which isn't a bad thing in principle. It's part of what makes a live service game feel live. I say all of this because of how crucial it is for a digital ecosystem to act like an ecosystem. It has to feel alive, dynamic, and complex. World of Warcraft embodies that essence now more than it has in many, many years, and even though it's unrecognizable compared to its classic origins, The War Within feels as though, for the first time, the modern game has defined its own identity independent of what World of Warcraft used to be. The War Within is a confident declaration by Blizzard that the Worldsoul Saga will elevate the game on all fronts. The narrative, the storytelling, the exploration, the gameplay, and we've barely scratched the surface of this first chapter. It's still so difficult to believe that only 3 years ago, it felt as though World of Warcraft had firmly sealed itself shut in a coffin of its own design. Compared to what the game looked like during Shadowlands, World of Warcraft is completely unrecognizable, and all the better for it. So if you aren't playing The War Within, I have no idea what you're waiting for. To be entirely honest, this video took so long to make because The War Within is just that good. If it hasn't already been said, then let me be the one to say that while it's true that no king rules forever, World of Warcraft is a long way from ceding the throne as the best MMORPG on the market. Even after 20 years, there's still no one that does it better. Bravo, Blizzard. Bravo. Before we say goodbye, allow me to offer a special thank you to JG Chowder on Patreon for chipping in to make this video possible. This video was a humongous undertaking, and I am just so glad that it's over. Remember that you can get all of my videos 2 days early and ad-free for only $1 a month on Patreon. Find me on Twitter and Twitch if you're interested. Relevant links are in the description. If you want more content like this, then make sure to subscribe, hit that bell before you go, leave a like, and definitely a comment. I read them all and I respond to most. Otherwise, minding my manners, of course. Thanks for watching.